The morning air shatters with the roar of Ottoman cannon. A massive Turkish bombard called the Great Gun, 20 feet long, capable of hurling stone balls weighing half a ton, belches fire and smoke. The projectile arcs through the dawn sky, a black meteor against the pale light, and crashes into the Corinthian gate with the force of divine wrath. Stone explodes outward in a deadly spray. Dust billows up like the breath of demons. Through the choking cloud, a gap appears in Vienna's ancient walls, 15 feet wide, gaping like a mortal wound. For a heartbeat, silence. Then, from the Ottoman trenches, rises a sound that freezes blood, the war cry of 100,000 warriors. Allahu Akbar! Allah is great! The elite Janissaries surge forward, their white Burke caps bobbing like foam on a tide of steel. Drums thunder, zurnas wail. The final assault on the last free city standing between Suleiman the Magnificent and the heart of Europe has begun. Atop the crumbling battlements, Nicholas, Count of Salm, 60 years old with a body broken by 4 decades of war, raises his sword. Blood seeps through the bandages wrapped around his chest, a Turkish arrow wound from yesterday that should have killed him. His voice, hoarse from shouting, somehow carries over the din. "They come for your children, your wives, your God. Will you let them pass?" "Never." The response erupts from 16,000 throats, soldiers, citizens, women, children, everyone who can hold a weapon or carry a stone. As the Ottoman host charges toward the breach, Vienna's defenders rush to meet them. The fate of Christendom will be decided in a gap barely wide enough for 4 men to stand abreast. The old count knows, as he leads the charge toward certain death, that behind these walls lies not just a city, but an idea. That somewhere, somehow, the relentless Ottoman tide can be stopped. That David can still defeat Goliath. That faith, courage, and desperation can triumph over the greatest military machine the world has ever seen. He is about to be proven right. To understand why 120,000 Ottoman soldiers stood before Vienna's gates in the autumn of 1529, we must first understand 2 men whose rivalry would reshape the world. Suleiman the Magnificent, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Born in 1494, Suleiman ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1520 at age 25. He inherited an empire that stretched from Algeria to Azerbaijan, from Hungary to Yemen, the most powerful state on earth. But Suleiman was not content with inheritance. He was obsessed with destiny. Suleiman saw himself as the heir to both Alexander the Great and the Roman Caesars, explains Dr. Christine Isom Verhaeren, professor of Ottoman history at Brigham Young University. He believed he was destined to unite the entire world under Islamic rule. Vienna was not just another conquest, it was the gateway to universal empire. Standing 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5, Suleiman cut an impressive figure. Contemporary accounts describe his aquiline nose, penetrating dark eyes, and hands that could sign death warrants or compose poetry with equal grace. He spoke 7 languages, wrote sophisticated verses under the pen name Muhibbi, the lover, and personally led his armies on 13 major campaigns. By 1529, Suleiman had already achieved the impossible. He had conquered Belgrade, 1521, the mighty fortress that had repelled Ottoman attacks for over a century. He had crushed the Kingdom of Hungary at the catastrophic Battle of Mohacs, 1526, where young King Louis II drowned in a marsh fleeing Turkish cavalry. He had turned the Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. Now, at 35, at the height of his powers, he set his sights on the ultimate prize. Vienna, seat of the Habsburg dynasty, gateway to Germany and the rich lands beyond. Charles V, Suleiman's great rival, ruled an empire on which the sun never set. Spain, the Netherlands, half of Italy, vast swathes of Germany, and the newly discovered Americas. Born in 1500, he had been elected Holy Roman Emperor at 19, making him nominal overlord of all Christian Europe. But Charles's strength was also his weakness. His territories were scattered, his attention divided among 1,000 crises. While Suleiman could focus the full might of his centralized empire on a single objective, Charles was perpetually fighting on multiple fronts. Against France, against Protestant rebels, against Barbary pirates, against his own rebellious subjects. In 1529, as Suleiman marched on Vienna, Charles was not even in Austria. He was in Italy, negotiating with Pope Clement VII, whom he had recently held prisoner after his troops sacked Rome. The defense of Vienna, and by extension all of Central Europe, would fall to Charles's younger brother, Ferdinand. Archduke Ferdinand I of Austria was everything his brother Charles was not, methodical where Charles was impulsive, cautious where Charles was bold, present where Charles was absent. Born in 1503, Ferdinand had inherited Austria and been elected King of Bohemia and Hungary, what little remained of it after Mohacs. In the summer of 1529, Ferdinand faced an impossible situation. Intelligence reports confirmed that Suleiman had left Constantinople in May with the largest army ever assembled by the Ottoman Empire. Over 300,000 men, according to some terrified estimates, though modern historians put the number at 120,000 to 150,000. Against this, Ferdinand could muster perhaps 20,000 professional soldiers, and even these were scattered across his territories. Ferdinand's correspondence from this period reveals a man on the edge of panic, notes Dr. Paula Sutter-Fichtner, author of Ferdinand Erst of Austria, The Politics of Dynasticism. He begged Charles for help, pleaded with German princes for troops, even considered abandoning Vienna entirely. That he chose to make a stand was as much desperation as courage. Vienna in 1529 was a shadow of what it would become. With a population of barely 25,000, it was smaller than London, Paris, or Constantinople. Its walls, built in the 13th century, were outdated by Renaissance standards, too low, too thin, designed for an age before gunpowder. Yet Vienna held symbolic importance far exceeding its size. It was the eastern bulwark of Christendom, the front line between cross and crescent. If Vienna fell, the road to Germany lay open. Augsburg, Nuremberg, even Rome itself would be within reach of Ottoman armies. The city's governor was Nicholas, Count of Salm, a grizzled veteran who had fought in Italy, France, and Germany. At 60, he should have been enjoying retirement on his estates. Instead, he found himself commanding humanity's last stand against what seemed an invincible tide. On May 10, 1529, Suleiman departed Constantinople with unprecedented pageantry. The procession took 3 days to pass through the city gates. First came the Akuncha, irregular light cavalry, who served as scouts and raiders. Then the Azabs, provincial infantry drawn from Anatolia and the Balkans. The Janissaries followed, 12,000 of them, the elite infantry that had never known defeat. Behind them rolled the artillery train, 300 cannons, including monstrous siege guns that required 60 oxen each to pull. The supply train stretched for miles, 30,000 camels, 10,000 mules, herds of cattle and sheep, portable mills, field hospitals, even a mobile mint to strike coins. Suleiman himself rode in the center, surrounded by the Sipahi of the port, his personal cavalry guard. His tent, when erected, covered an acre and required 300 men to raise. It contained audience chambers, sleeping quarters, a mosque, and even a bath, a portable palace that proclaimed Ottoman power. The march north was a masterpiece of logistics. Ottoman engineers bridged rivers, cleared roads, and established supply depots with clockwork efficiency. The Ottoman army of 1529 was not a medieval horde, but an early modern military machine, observes Dr. Gabor Auguston, specialist in Ottoman military history at Georgetown University. Their logistics, artillery, and engineering capabilities exceeded anything in contemporary Europe. Yet even Ottoman efficiency could not overcome nature. The spring of 1529 was the wettest in memory. Rain fell in torrents, turning roads into quagmires. Rivers burst their banks. The heavy siege artillery, crucial for breaching Vienna's walls, fell further and further behind. Dysentery and typhus began claiming lives. By September 3rd, Suleiman reached Buda, the former Hungarian capital. Here he paused, installing John Zapolya as his puppet king of Hungary and waiting for his scattered forces to concentrate. The delay would prove crucial. Every day lost meant fighting closer to winter. At Buda, Suleiman received disturbing intelligence. Vienna was not the easy target he had expected. Ferdinand had used the summer wisely, reinforcing the walls, stockpiling supplies, and gathering troops. Worse, the German princes, usually paralyzed by religious divisions between Catholics and Protestants, had united in the face of the Turkish threat. Reinforcements were marching toward Vienna. Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's Grand Vizier and closest friend, advised caution. "My Sultan," he reportedly said, "Vienna is far from our bases. The season grows late, and our heavy guns are still mired in Hungarian mud. Perhaps we should winter in Buda and attack in spring." But Suleiman, invincible in 13 years of rule, would not hear of retreat. "Allah has given us victory at Belgrade and Mohacs. He will give us Vienna as well. We march." While Suleiman advanced, Count Nicholas of Salm worked miracles with limited resources. Appointed commander of Vienna's defense on September 5th, he had less than 3 weeks before the Ottoman vanguard would arrive. His first act was brutal but necessary. He ordered the suburbs burned. Every building outside the walls, churches, monasteries, homes where generations had lived, was put to the torch. He would give the Turks no shelter, no cover for their approach. The citizens wept as they watched their property burn, but Nicholas knew tears were preferable to Turkish slavery. Next came the walls. Vienna's medieval fortifications were reinforced with earthen ramparts, better able to absorb cannon shot than stone alone. Every able-bodied person, man, woman, and child over 10, was conscripted for labor. Nobles worked alongside peasants, priests beside prostitutes, all united by mortal terror. What Nicholas achieved in those 3 weeks was extraordinary, writes Dr. Simon Millar, author of The Siege of Vienna, 1529, The Ottoman High Tide. He transformed a medieval city into an early modern fortress, created a unified command from fractious elements, and most importantly, gave the Viennese hope that resistance was possible. Among the defenders was a remarkable figure, Nicholas Graf Salm, not to be confused with Count Nicholas, a 30-year-old mercenary captain commanding 700 Spanish harquebusiers, elite soldiers armed with early firearms. Born into minor nobility in the Rhineland, Nicholas had fought in the Italian wars, earning a reputation for both courage and tactical innovation. On September 18th, as he supervised the placement of his men along the walls, Nicholas wrote to his wife Anna, "My beloved, I fear this letter may be our last correspondence. The Turk approaches with numbers beyond counting, yet I find my spirit strangely calm. We fight not for gold or glory, but for Christendom itself. If I fall, know that I fell facing the enemy, my duty done. Kiss our children and tell them their father stood at Vienna." Nicholas would survive the siege, but barely. His letters, preserved in the Vienna State Archives, provide our most intimate glimpse into the defenders' experience. Not all Vienna's defenders were professional soldiers. Katharina Weiss, 22 years old, daughter of a master baker, found herself thrust into history's spotlight. When the siege began, she organized the city's women into auxiliary units, some to tend wounded, others to carry ammunition, still others to prepare the dreaded Greek fire that would be poured on attacking Turks. Years later, interviewed by a Jesuit chronicler, she recalled, We were all afraid, terribly afraid, but fear became anger, and anger became determination. When you see your home threatened, your family in danger, you find strength you never knew existed. I saw noble ladies who had never lifted anything heavier than a wine cup carrying cauldrons of boiling oil to the ramparts. Katerina's bakery, strategically located near the Corinthian gate, became an impromptu command post. Her father baked bread day and night to feed the defenders, while Katerina coordinated the women's auxiliaries. She would personally participate in the defense of the October 14th breach, throwing stones down on Turkish soldiers attempting to scale the rubble. The Ottoman army arrived before Vienna like a plague of locusts. From the walls, defenders watched in horror as the earth itself seemed to change color, brown and green giving way to the myriad hues of Ottoman tents. The Turks made camp in a great crescent, cutting Vienna off from all hope of relief. That first evening, Suleiman sent a herald to the gates under a flag of truce. The message was simple. Surrender now and your lives will be spared. Your property will be protected, your faith respected. Resist, and every man will be killed, every woman and child enslaved, your city erased from the earth. Count Nicholas's response was equally direct. Tell your master that Vienna's gates will open only when every defender is dead. We recommend he brings his winter clothes. Lacking his super-heavy siege artillery, still stuck somewhere in Hungary, Suleiman turned to an ancient method, mining. Ottoman engineers, many of them Christian renegades who knew European fortification techniques, began digging tunnels toward Vienna's walls. The plan was simple. Excavate chambers beneath the fortifications, pack them with gunpowder, and blow the walls sky-high. But the Viennese were ready. Count Nicholas had recruited miners from the Tyrolean silver mines, men who knew underground warfare. Countermines were begun, aimed at intercepting the Turkish tunnels. What followed was a terrifying subterranean war. In narrow tunnels lit only by flickering torches, Austrian and Ottoman miners fought savage battles with picks, shovels, and knives. Sometimes they would break into enemy tunnels and flood them with smoke or water. Other times, they would hear enemy miners just feet away, separated only by thin walls of earth, and detonate charges to bury them alive. The mining war at Vienna represented medieval siege warfare's last gasp, notes Dr. Christopher Duffy, author of Siege Warfare, The Fortress in the Early Modern World. It was intimate, terrifying, and ultimately futile. Despite enormous effort and casualties, not a single Ottoman mine succeeded in bringing down Vienna's walls. If you appreciate stories like this, where individual courage meets historical destiny, where ordinary people rise to extraordinary challenges, consider how the Siege of Vienna reminds us that civilization's survival has often hung by the thinnest of threads. The defenders of Vienna weren't superhuman. They were bakers, merchants, soldiers, and nobles who chose to stand when standing seemed impossible. After 10 days of bombardment and mining, Suleiman ordered a general assault. At dawn, the attack began with a bombardment from 300 cannons. The lighter field pieces the Ottomans had managed to bring could damage but not breach Vienna's reinforced walls. Still, the psychological effect was devastating. The ground shook, stones cracked, and the air filled with lethal fragments. Then came the human wave. Azab infantry rushed forward with scaling ladders, while Janissaries provided covering fire with their matchlock muskets. The defenders responded with everything they had: arquebus fire, crossbow bolts, stones, boiling oil, and Greek fire, a napalm-like substance that stuck to armor and flesh. At the Corinthian gate, the fighting was fiercest. Here, Nicholas Graf Salm's Spanish arquebusiers proved their worth. Firing in disciplined volleys, they cut down wave after wave of attackers. When Turks reached the walls, the defenders pushed the scaling ladders back with long poles, sending screaming men plummeting to their deaths. The assault lasted 8 hours. When Suleiman finally called retreat, over 3,000 Ottoman soldiers lay dead before the walls. Vienna had lost 400 defenders, a grievous toll for the outnumbered garrison, but a clear tactical victory. As October progressed, Vienna's greatest ally revealed itself: winter. Temperatures plummeted, cold rain turned to sleet. In the Ottoman camp, morale crumbled like old bread. The Janissaries, elite troops accustomed to victory and proper quarters, found themselves shivering in inadequate tents, eating reduced rations, watching their comrades die from disease more than enemy action. Suleiman himself maintained an appearance of confidence, but privately, doubts gnawed at him. His war council was divided. Ibrahim Pasha, always the voice of reason, argued for withdrawal. "My Sultan, we have shown our power. All Europe trembles, but we cannot fight both the Austrians and winter. Let us return next year with proper preparation." But the younger commanders, hungry for glory and plunder, urged continued assault. They had come so far, sacrificed so much, surely Vienna must fall soon. Inside Vienna, the situation was equally desperate. Food was running low. Most citizens were down to 1 meal a day. Ammunition was scarce. Worst of all, Count Nicholas of Salm was dying. The arrow wound in his chest had become infected. Fever racked his body, yet he refused to leave his post, commanding from a chair when he could no longer stand. On the night of October 12th, Nicholas called his senior commanders for what many believed would be their final council. The room was lit by candles that threw dancing shadows on grim faces. Outside, they could hear the Turkish drums maintaining their psychological warfare. "Gentlemen," Nicholas began, his voice barely above a whisper, "our scouts report massive Turkish preparations. Tomorrow or the day after, they will launch their final assault. We have powder for perhaps one more day of fighting. After that—" He paused, coughing blood into a handkerchief. "After that, it will be sword and pike against an ocean of enemies." Nicholas Graf Salm spoke up. "My lord, my arquebusiers have 40 rounds per man remaining. We'll make each shot count." "And the walls?" Nicholas asked. The master engineer, Wilhelm von Roggendorf, shook his head grimly. "The Corinthian gate cannot withstand another concentrated bombardment. When it falls, they'll pour through like water through a broken dam." Silence fell. Then, from the back of the room, came an unexpected voice. Katharina Weiss had been admitted to the council as representative of the civilian auxiliaries. "My lords," she said, "you speak as if we're already defeated. But look outside. Do you see Turkish banners on our walls?" "No. We've held for 2 weeks against the world's greatest army. Every day we survive is a miracle. Who's to say tomorrow won't bring another?" Her words, naive perhaps, but filled with desperate hope, somehow rallied the room. Count Nicholas actually smiled. "The baker's daughter speaks truth. We are not dead yet. Tomorrow we fight. God will decide the rest." The attack began before dawn with the heaviest bombardment yet. Every Ottoman cannon fired in sequence, concentrating on the weakened Corinthian gate. By sunrise, a practical breach had been opened, not wide, but enough. Suleiman committed everything to this assault. The Janissaries would lead, their reputation and honor at stake. Behind them, wave after wave of provincial troops would exploit any success. The Sultan himself, mounted on his white Arabian stallion, took position where his men could see him, his presence a promise of reward for victory or death for failure. The Ottoman military band played at maximum volume. Drums, cymbals, zurnas, creating a wall of sound designed to terrorize. Then, with a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself, 20,000 men charged simultaneously. Count Nicholas, despite his mortal weakness, had himself carried to the breach. Propped against rubble, sword in hand, he prepared to meet death as he had met life, facing forward. The Janissaries reached the breach first. These were the Ottoman Empire's finest, recruited as children, trained for 20 years, knowing no family but the corps, no father but the Sultan. They fought with mechanical precision, each man covering his fellow, advancing step by bloody step through the gap. Meeting them were Vienna's last reserves. A motley force of professional soldiers, armed citizens, even women like Katharina Weiss. What they lacked in training they made up in desperation. This was literally their last stand. Behind them lay their families, their homes, everything they held dear. The fighting in the breach was medieval in its savagery. No room for clever tactics or firearms, just blade against blade, strength against strength, will against will. Bodies piled so high they formed a second wall. Blood made the rubble slippery as ice. Men fought in a red mist of exhaustion and fury. For 2 hours, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. The Janissaries gained ground inch by inch. Count Nicholas fell, finally succumbing to his wounds but taking 2 Turks with him as he died. It seemed Vienna must fall. Then, at approximately 8 a.m., something unexpected happened. On the horizon, rockets burst in the sky, signal rockets from an approaching relief force. Whether this was actually Charles V's army approaching, it wasn't. They were still days away, or a desperate deception by Austrian scouts remains debated by historians. But the effect was immediate and dramatic. The Ottoman troops, already exhausted and demoralized, believed a fresh imperial army was about to fall on their rear. Panic spread like wildfire. The assault wavered, stopped, then reversed. Suleiman, seeing his men streaming back from the breach, made the hardest decision of his reign. At 8:47 a.m. on October 14, 1529, he ordered the general retreat. The Siege of Vienna was over. For Suleiman the Magnificent, who had never known defeat, the withdrawal from Vienna was a personal catastrophe carefully disguised as strategic regrouping. Ottoman chroniclers, writing under imperial supervision, portrayed it as a voluntary withdrawal after achieving the campaign's true objective, installing John Zapoya as King of Hungary. But the common soldiers knew better. As they struck camp on October 15th, snow began falling, 2 months early. The weather that had been Vienna's ally now became the retreating army's nightmare. The march south became an ordeal that rivaled the siege itself. Snow turned to blizzards. Supply lines, already stretched, snapped entirely. Thousands of men froze to death. The magnificent Ottoman army that had advanced like a tide now retreated like a broken flood, leaving a trail of abandoned equipment and corpses. The retreat from Vienna marked the high watermark of Ottoman expansion in Europe, observes Dr. Caroline Finkel, author of Osman's Dream, The History of the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman would live another 37 years and achieve many victories, but he would never again threaten the heart of Christian Europe. Vienna was where Ottoman invincibility died. Inside Vienna, celebration mixed with exhaustion and grief. Of the city's 25,000 inhabitants, nearly 2,000 had died. Every family mourned someone. Count Nicholas of Salm was buried with full honors in St. Stephen's Cathedral, where his tomb can still be seen today. The city itself was a wreck. Entire districts lay in ruins. The walls were so damaged that it would take years to fully repair them. Disease, always the companion of siege warfare, claimed hundreds more lives in the weeks following Turkish withdrawal. Yet Vienna had achieved the impossible. A small, outdated city had stopped the Ottoman Empire at its zenith. The psychological impact rippled across Europe. If Vienna could resist, perhaps the Turk was not invincible after all. Emperor Charles V, finally arriving with his relief army in late October, found not a conquered city to liberate but victorious heroes to celebrate. He would claim credit for the victory, of course, but everyone knew the truth. Vienna had saved itself. The successful defense of Vienna in 1529 had immediate strategic implications. Suleiman's failure to take the city effectively established the Habsburg-Ottoman frontier in Hungary for the next 150 years. The Ottomans retained central Hungary, the Habsburgs held the western strip, and Transylvania became a semi-independent buffer state. For Ferdinand I, The siege transformed him from Charles V's overlooked younger brother into a hero of Christendom. He would be elected Holy Roman Emperor after Charles's abdication, founding the Austrian-Habsburg line that would rule until 1918. The siege also accelerated military innovation. The Ottoman failure highlighted the growing importance of gunpowder weapons and modern fortifications. Across Europe, cities began updating their medieval walls with new Italian-style Tres Italienne fortifications designed to withstand artillery. Vienna itself would be transformed into one of Europe's most formidable fortresses. One unexpected consequence was the siege's impact on the Reformation. The Ottoman threat had forced Catholic and Protestant princes to suspend their religious warfare. Charles V, needing Protestant support against the Turks, had to moderate his anti-Reformation policies. The Turks were, inadvertently, the Reformation's greatest protectors, notes Dr. Thomas Kaufmann, professor of church history at the University of Göttingen. Every time Charles V prepared to crush Protestant resistance, the Ottoman threat would force him to compromise. Luther himself called the Turks God's rod of anger against a corrupt Christendom. The Siege of 1529 entered European consciousness as a defining moment when Christendom stood at the brink. In Austria, it became a foundation myth for Habsburg legitimacy. Every subsequent generation would invoke the heroes of 1529 when facing existential threats. Art and literature celebrated the siege. Paintings depicted Count Nicholas's last stand. Poems sang of Viennese courage. The story of the baker's daughter, possibly Katharina Weiss, though her name varies in different accounts, who helped defend the walls, became a folk tale told to inspire young women. Even culinary culture was affected. The croissant, according to legend, likely apocryphal, was invented by Viennese bakers to celebrate victory over the Turks, its crescent shape mocking the Ottoman symbol. Whether true or not, the story illustrates how deeply the siege penetrated popular culture. The Second Siege, 1683. Vienna would face Ottoman siege again in 1683, this time by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, commanding an even larger army. Once again, the city would hold until relief arrived, this time led by Polish King Jan III Sobieski. The 1683 siege often overshadows 1529 in popular memory. But historians recognize that the first siege was more significant in halting Ottoman expansion at its peak. After 1529, the Ottoman-Habsburg conflict continued for centuries but gradually shifted in Europe's favor. The Ottomans' failure to adapt to evolving military technology, their increasing internal problems, and the rise of new European powers slowly reversed the balance. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe, its territories gradually stripped away. The empire that had threatened to conquer all Europe in 1529 would dissolve entirely in 1922, replaced by the modern Turkish Republic. The Siege of Vienna continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about European identity, Christian-Islamic relations, and the nature of civilization itself. Unfortunately, it has also been appropriated by extremists on both sides. Some Islamists see it as a rallying cry for renewed conquest, while some Western extremists invoke it to justify anti-Muslim prejudice. The danger in commemorating events like the 1529 siege, warns Dr. Eugene Rogan, director of the Middle East Center at Oxford, is reading modern conflicts back into historical events. The Ottoman Empire was not pursuing a religious war, but imperial expansion. Many Christians fought for the Ottomans, many Muslims would later fight for the Habsburgs. History is always more complex than mythology. As we stand nearly 500 years removed from that desperate autumn, what lessons does the Siege of Vienna offer our modern world? First, it reminds us that freedom has always required sacrifice. The Viennese of 1529 did not choose their historical moment. It was thrust upon them, but when the crisis came, ordinary people rose to meet it. Bakers became warriors, women became defenders, a dying count became immortal through his final stand. Democracy and freedom are not inevitable, reflects Dr. Niall Ferguson, historian at Stanford's Hoover Institution. They survive only when people are willing to defend them. Vienna 1529 shows that small groups of determined defenders can hold off seemingly overwhelming force, if they have the will. The siege also reminds us to avoid simplistic narratives. This was not a simple clash of Christianity versus Islam. The Ottoman army included thousands of Christian soldiers. Some of Vienna's defenders were probably converts from Islam. Both sides included multiple ethnicities, languages, and cultures. Suleiman the Magnificent was not a barbarian, but one of history's most sophisticated rulers, a lawgiver, poet, and patron of arts. Count Nicholas of Salm was not a spotless hero, but a professional soldier who had spent his career fighting other Christians for pay. History resists our attempts to divide it into neat categories of good and evil. The siege's outcome hung on contingencies that no one could have predicted. What if the spring of 1529 had been dry, allowing Ottoman heavy artillery to reach Vienna? What if Count Nicholas had died from his wound a day earlier? What if those signal rockets hadn't appeared at just the right moment? History is shaped by human will and structural forces, but also by pure chance, observes Dr. Margaret Macmillan, author of War: How Conflict Shaped Us. Vienna reminds us that the future is never predetermined. Individual choices and random events can alter the trajectory of civilizations. Vienna in 1529 was strategically important, but its symbolic value exceeded its military worth. For Christian Europe, it represented the possibility of resistance. For the Ottomans, it became the fortress that got away, a psychological wound that never fully healed. Today's world is equally shaped by symbolic victories and defeats. The fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11, the Arab Spring. These events matter not just for their immediate impact, but for what they represent in collective imagination. Vienna teaches us that sometimes holding a symbolic position, no matter the cost, can change history's trajectory. Ultimately, the Siege of Vienna is not about abstract forces, but about human beings facing impossible odds. It's about Count Nicholas dying on his feet rather than living on his knees. It's about Katharina Weiss choosing to fight rather than hide. It's about thousands of ordinary people deciding that some things are worth risking everything to defend. Their story reminds us that we are not passive observers of history, but active participants. The choices we make, individually and collectively, shape the world our children will inherit. The Viennese of 1529 could not have known that their desperate defense would help determine the cultural and political shape of Europe for centuries to come. They fought because it was right, because it was necessary, because they could do nothing else. Today, Vienna is a modern metropolis of nearly 2 million people, capital of the neutral Austrian Republic, host to the United Nations. The medieval walls are gone, replaced by the beautiful Ringstrasse Boulevard. St. Stephen's Cathedral, which survived the siege, still stands, its Gothic spire reaching toward heaven. In the Heeresgeschichtliches Museum, you can see artifacts from the siege, rusted swords, Ottoman banners, a portrait of Count Nicholas. They seem impossibly remote, relics of an alien world. Yet the human truths they represent, courage, sacrifice, the defense of home and principle, remain eternal. If you walk through Vienna's first district at dawn, when the tourists are asleep and the city belongs to its residents, you might sense something of what it was like on those October mornings in 1529. The stones remember, even if we forget. They remember the terror and the triumph, the prayers and the battle cries, the moment when history balanced on a knife's edge. The Siege of Vienna teaches us that walls, physical, cultural, psychological, both protect and imprison. They are necessary, but not sufficient. The true defense of any civilization lies not in its fortifications, but in the hearts of its defenders, in their willingness to stand when standing seems impossible. On October 15th, 1529, as snow fell on the Ottoman retreat and Vienna's church bells rang in celebration, the immediate future seemed secure. The Turks were gone, the city had survived, Christendom was saved. But history doesn't end with victory or defeat. It continues, presenting new challenges that require new courage. The Viennese who survived the siege would face plague, religious warfare, and economic hardship. Their children would confront Swedish invasion during the 30 Years' War. Their grandchildren would face the Ottomans again in 1683. Each generation would have to decide anew whether to resist or submit, whether to stand or flee. We face the same choice in our own time. The threats are different. Terrorism rather than siege warfare, climate change rather than early winter, pandemic rather than plague. But the fundamental question remains: when history calls, will we answer? When our moment comes, will we stand? The defenders of Vienna in 1529 show us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they must. They remind us that civilization is not guaranteed, but must be actively preserved by each generation. They teach us that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. As the sun sets over modern Vienna, painting the sky the same red it showed on those desperate October days nearly 500 years ago, we might remember Count Nicholas's last words, reported by a priest who gave him last rites. "Tell them we held. Tell them Vienna stands." Vienna still stands. The question for our generation is simple. What will we defend with such determination? What walls will we hold when our moment comes? The answer, as in 1529, will shape the centuries to come.